It's 2020 and the biggest civil war in Star Wars is amongst its fans, spouting things like, the new trilogy sucks, at least the prequels had heart, and most importantly, this doesn't even feel like Star Wars. But what is Star Wars? A New Hope? That's some Star Wars. Star Wars Rebels? Is that Star Wars? The Last Jedi? Probably not Star Wars. The Empire Strikes Back? Now that's Star Wars. Guardians of the Galaxy? Is that technically Star Wars? What is Star Wars? Star Wars is the collection of 11 feature films, 12 if you count the animated one, 5 television shows, hundreds of original novels, comics, video games with canon and fan fiction stories alike, and one excellent holiday special with an old and overeager Grandpa Wookiee. This full collection of media has been assembled since 1977 and hasn't stopped to this day. When you picture Star Wars, what do you see? Gold planets, lasers in space, unique practical aliens drinking space junk, John Williams scores, is it the story, characters experiencing hardship coming to terms with fate, and what about the lore that's been built by years and years of new media being added to the franchise? There's a lot to think about when it comes to Star Wars. Let's go over the quick history of the film franchise. Maybe the essence of Star Wars is somewhere in there. The 70s and 80s were graced with the original miracles. Star Wars, later A New Hope or Episode 4, was a uniquely fresh take on the hero's journey with elements pulled from samurai films and science fiction, fully realized using high-end practical and digital effects for the time. The experimental film was a hit and brought us the holy, eternal masterpiece, The Empire Strikes Back, followed by the other one, Return of the Jedi. These 3 films are likely the firm, beating heart of what Star Wars is. Good storytelling, fun and relatable characters, interesting premise, sweeping symphonies, James Earl Jones breathing, practical effects for days, and a Sarlacc pit. After the 3rd or 6th episode, I guess, put a lid on the series, George Lucas took the pot and spilled it all over the 2000s. Modern society was horrified by the war crimes committed by the hands of 21st century Fox. Too much youngling blood was spilt, the sand proved too resilient and coarse, and we discovered George was better at imagining stories than writing about them. He handed the franchise over to the Disney overlords for $4.05 billion Mickey bucks in 2012. Were the prequel films Star Wars? Yeah, I guess. They had lightsabers. There was the funny alien Dumbo-eared guy. John Williams was doing his best to try and save the trilogy with the power of song. The story was a bit muddy, but there was a Skywalker guy, and he was mad, and it made him into Darth Vader. Yeah, Star Wars. Then came a whole new trilogy of films, the next set of epics to inspire a 3rd generation. Looking to right the sins of Lucas from Phantom, Attack, and Revenge, 2015 blasted us with The Force Awakens. What a great title to begin the story anew. After the grand conclusion of Episode 6, where the Force is finally put into a semblance of balance, the magnificent franchise was back, and it was helmed by none other than the human lens flare J.J. Abrams himself. The Force Awakens was a promising beginning to a new franchise. Though it was seen as a quote-unquote safe film, derivative of its successful predecessors, it remained familiar enough and brought enough new content to the table to feel fresh. The success of the film was unprecedented, as it invited 2 generations of fans and introduced a new generation into the galactic Star Wars franchise. Now this movie was a promising Star Wars. It had all the stuff from the last film franchises, just less crappy dialogue and logic. Those practical effects looked pretty good next to the digital ones, and they had a Death Star again, but bigger. You remember that thing, right? It's a Star Wars. But you can't just make the same movie over and over again. Disney was not eager to use the original franchise's story as a blueprint for the new trilogy. And so they handed the sequel's reins to Rian Johnson, who was allegedly photographed on set taking the film franchise around back to put her down. Rian recognized the sameness of episodes 4 and 7 and chose to take the film franchise in a different direction. Despite The Last Jedi being met with great critical reception, the fan base hated it. It wasn't Star Wars. And the jury was still out for Rogue One and Solo as to whether those films were actually Star Wars themselves. Well, these movies just aren't Star Wars. Where even was Duel of the Fates? Leia has force powers? Well, I hate these movies now. They aren't Star Wars movies. Disney, make JJ undo all the bad stuff. Come on, guys. Just give me a little Star Wars here. Disney took the note and punched the last film of the franchise, the central media binding the entirety of the saga and all its subsequent canon media back to JJ, the Star Wars man himself. JJ took a look in the mirror, had a deep breath, and dug up the film that Rian had buried out back. Its corpse was bloated and rotten, and JJ had to do something to make it up to the fans. He went forward with his vision from The Force Awakens and attempted to weave it through the mess of The Last Jedi. Out came The Rise of Skywalker, which has been met with poor critical reception, but an excellent response from the fans. Without getting into spoilers, The Rise of Skywalker had an enormous weight on its back. Not only did it have to put a cap on all of the movies before it, it had to be specifically intertwined with the two films before, which were very much at odds with one another. It was apparent that JJ and Ryan had different ideas for what Star Wars was. On top of that, it needed to be a crowd pleaser if it was going to avoid being as polarizing as The Last Jedi. These weights can seriously hamper a film. Above all else, a film should focus on storytelling. Storytelling was the absolute strength of the original trilogy. The universe the story was set in only complemented it. Through the world building presented in the story, generations of fans were inspired. Hundreds of artists have sought to pull from the wealth of Star Wars' universe and use it to create their own stories. Star Wars has become a staple in the world's culture, and its vast universe, and all the Mickey bucks, have much to do with its enormous rise. Unfortunately, the audience for the franchise has become just so damn big that any direction a creator chooses to take the franchise can irreparably harm it, considering all the eyes consuming it. The Last Jedi, despite its obvious faults, heard the criticisms of the film before it. Things were too much of the same. A new Death Star, a new Emperor, a new Luke and Han, and so many familiar characters. Disney recognizes this and punts the franchise to Rian Johnson, an accomplished director, C. Looper, and tells him to go the way he wants to go with the franchise. He does that, and fans are absolutely appalled by the results. It wasn't Star Wars. So Disney punts the franchise back to J.J. Abrams, a man never known for really seeing a franchise through. JJ is given full creative integrity, and he shows us why he really hasn't finished a franchise. The original trilogy became such a large hit because of its inventive storytelling. We care about Luke through his adventure. Luke meets interesting characters while exploring a universe ripe with discovery and interest, both of these elements pulling from the Force and the unique settings. Hang Lucas on a cross if you want, but the man has a talent for developing unique settings populated with interesting background characters and story. The prequels failed because they lent too much on the world building and the stories that went with it. A main character isn't established until halfway through the first film, and the second is inundated with awful dialogue and poor scenic structure. At least with the third film, we saw some payoff for all the terrible films before it, and it speaks some sort of structure, some direction between the films that keep the pace moving. Despite The Force Awakens' excellent return to form for the franchise, there was no sense of direction in terms of the storytelling. In many minds, The Last Jedi will go down as the worst film of the franchise, despite it sharing some of the newest ideas the entire saga had to offer. In the wake of that, The Rise of Skywalker mandated a return to fan service. Look, if you enjoy the feel of Star Wars, if you like the lightsabers and the Jedis and the space battles, you'll probably enjoy The Rise of Skywalker. It pays great homage to the series before it, and there's a lot to enjoy about that. However, as a finale to a trilogy and as an example of good storytelling, The Rise of Skywalker just does not deliver. It's ironic how Disney was able to acquire Marvel and plan out one of the greatest film franchises of all time, literally coining the phrase cinematic universe. Through the acquisition of Lucasfilms, Disney had the opportunity to pull off a second similar hit with this decade-long trilogy. Unfortunately, Disney could never just figure out what the definition of Star Wars was. And how could they? What other franchise has lasted nearly 50 years of consistent creation? Most franchises barely survive a trilogy, if that. Despite the failings of many Star Wars films and other properties, you have to respect the power of the world building at hand that has inspired years and years of fans. Through every film, every book, every comic, every toy, every iteration of the idea of Star Wars, all the fans got a different idea of what it meant to them. It's just not possible to resonate with every single person. The only unfortunate thing about this is that Disney, the single-handedly largest media company ever known to man, fell into the same trap George Lucas did after he created the original excellent trilogy. World building alone does not beat good storytelling and interesting characters. But the new trilogy is over. We've seen what Disney has to offer, and they've hit some decent notes. Thankfully, the universe of Star Wars is rich enough to offer plenty of room for new and original stories. We've seen this with Rogue One and The Mandalorian, and hopefully the executives at Mickey Mouse headquarters recognize the value of unique storytelling over the limp power of just patting fans on the back.